Hello and welcome to week 5 of the Psychology of Organizational Development. This class covers how to diagnose an organizational problem. There are 3 main topics for this lecture: grades, teams, and problems. Your Quiz 2 feedback is available. Please check it and let me know if there are any issues. I have arranged this class of 12 into 4 groups of 3. I may have to add a 4th member to some teams in the event that there are course withdrawals that would put a group under 3 members. So that could happen. I will take some time today to talk about team processes. So you should arrange your first group meeting and get to know each other to make your strengths and weaknesses and boundaries known to each other and to set some ground rules. Finally, I'll cover the subject of the reading for this class, which is on how to diagnose a problem. I am satisfied with class performance to date. I was satisfied with class performance on quiz 1. As the instructor, I expect that most students will get satisfactory or good grades. That means a class average in the C or B range. Typically, there are some students who are extra dedicated, highly talented, very conscientious, or very passionate about the subject that get A's. They're the exception, not the rule. A class in which everybody gets an A is likely a class in which the instructor is an agreeable people pleaser who can't set boundaries or enforce standards. That is not my style, and the behaviors that A students engage in do not represent the typical student skill level or personality type. Looking at some classroom OD efforts, securing accommodations had a universally beneficial effect. Everyone who got their accommodations saw an increase in performance. Students who took the practice quiz had higher grades on average. Bringing issues to my attention also improved class performance. I fixed a couple of quiz 1 grades, answered some questions, and debugged the practice quiz. And I have become aware that I can write a very long question, and so I'm going to work on that. Grades are somebody's assessment of your performance on some tasks according to some imperfect criteria. And they're going to range from vague to clear, and they won't be perfectly clear. And they'll range from subjective to objective. The answer to 2 + 2 is really easy to grade as incorrect because it's an answer that's objectively right or wrong. Grading is much more subjective in, say, the social sciences and humanities. That's just the way it is. Grading ranges from reasonable to unreasonable and from fair to unfair. I'm going to try to stay on the side of clarity and reasonable subjectivity and fairness. That said, graders vary in their expectations, and no grading scheme is ever going to test you on everything that you learned. You can get a failing grade on a deliverable or on a class and still have a worthwhile experience. You'll learn things and develop skills and insights that are not reflected in the grading scheme, and they still matter. The people who are teaching you and grading you are not omniscient or infallible. Okay, so lectures and textbooks do contain errors. In textbooks and in lectures, speculation is often presented as fact. There's overgeneralization and reification. Teachers are also learners. I have taught things in a really confident way that I now realize were wrong. So I used to teach the 5-factor model of personality, and now I teach the 6-factor hexaco model. But there are people out there, my former students, who think that the Big 5 model is the way to go. I'll also note that even when everything is going as well as it can, errors will make their way into a grading key. A colleague here helped me out by giving me test questions from his class that he had used on exams, and I had to throw out about 20% of the questions because there were errors in the grading key. So the grading key would say that A was the right answer, but I could see how both A and C were acceptable answers. If you had been a very well-prepared student in his class, you wouldn't have come out with 100, you would have come up with 80 or 85, even if you had everything right, just because of the grading key errors. And you won't know if they are there unless you check the key. I am relying on you to do that because there are things that I miss and mistakes that I don't catch. Grades are not a measure of self-worth. A lot of students will think that an F is a bad student, is a bad person, and an A is a good student and a good person. In my view, your worth as a person is unconditional and non-contingent. It doesn't depend on your performance. A student who gets an A is not worth more than a student who gets an F. A student who prepares is not worth more as a person than a student who's unprepared. A student who cheats is not worth less than a student who is honest. If you cheat and I catch you, there'll be consequences, but that's a totally different matter. A student with high cognitive ability is not worth more than a student with low cognitive ability. A student on academic probation is not worth less than the valedictorian, in my view. Anytime you elevate someone as having higher worth, as being a higher class of human, you dehumanize someone else, and probably not fairly. How much do you really know to judge that? What legitimate authority do you have to judge that? And what mistakes are you making when you do that? But we are in an academic system which has its culture, its norms, its expectations, its values, its rewards, and its punishments. And grades are part of that, but don't take them too seriously. Grades of A refer to excellent performance. B refers to good performance. C's refer to satisfactory performance. D refers to marginal performance, and F is unsatisfactory performance. Satisficing, which means getting satisfactory outcomes across everything you do, instead of throwing it all in for excellent performance at one particular thing, can be a very adaptive strategy. Grades of A's are required in some circumstances, so if you want to get into a competitive grad school and the subject of this class, if you want to win or maintain scholarships or bursaries, but if you're going out into the workforce, your employers will care that you graduate if a degree is even a required qualification. C's get degrees, and there are many jobs that people with undergraduate degrees don't require any degree. I hope that helps you stress less. Sometimes people think that they should get an A or really, really want one for some reason. I once had a student who really wanted to get an A in this class, and she worked really hard. She prepared, she connected with me, she had to handle the actively disengaged students in Team B. She resubmitted some work, and she really pulled her weight. At the end of the day, her final grade computed to a B, and I felt a little guilty. But a B is a good grade, and in this case it came with other good things that weren't reflected in the grading system, but still really mattered. Employers are overwhelmingly not going to ask to see your transcript unless you're applying for a teaching job. Final grades of D, F, or W are negative outcomes for me in my context, given my goals. I look for average grades in the C or the B range. Every class has what I was taught to call benchmark students, the ones who show up and seem to care and engage in good faith and be into it. I expect them to be the ones, by and large, that take the A's. Something I've noticed these students doing is reviewing my classes as being an easy A without understanding that the A was as much about their skills than the class I design. Another good reason to get an A could be that you've already done this before or are self-taught in the material. In every class I've taught, I have actively or passively disengaged students. Actively disengaged students sometimes cheat. They'll BS me about access issues like computer problems, Brightspace not working as the new version of the dog ate my homework, or they'll say that they can't get the textbook when we're surrounded by functioning devices at the university and there's a reserved copy of the book in the library. They'll present me with problems that over time I've come to recognize are actually not my responsibility to solve. I used to spend time with tech support on Brightspace trying to figure out access issues that were not real access issues, and I resented having spent my time on that. Passively disengaged students just aren't that into it or won't do the work. Maybe because they don't care, maybe because of anxiety, I don't know. Red flags for DFW outcomes are not handing things in, not being familiar with the syllabus, coming to class without doing the readings, demonstrating not listening by, say, doing something else on a laptop or being on a phone. Something that I've noticed these students doing is reviewing my class as intolerably boring and difficult without understanding that their D or F was as much about their own skills than as the class I design. Sometimes they go on Rate My Prof and lie about the class, saying that the final grade is based on few things instead of about 10 or 20, that there are no assignments, or that the tests require memorization. The worst instructors that I encountered in my own career as a student, ones who were fully deserving of a 1 out of 5 review, were genuinely lacking competence. They were careless and uncaring, or they did things that were unethical or even illegal. I frankly feel honored that my worst reviews are for being boring, for having standards, or some kind of defamatory face-saving performance on the part of somebody having felt put out by having legitimately earned a DFW outcome. Regarding boredom, much of science is detail and drudgery and dragging yourself through doing things that you don't like and learning to sort out what matters from what doesn't. I'm a long-winded person who's didactically lecturing you with big words and jargon. It is normal to be bored by all this. Normal brains wander after 15 to 20 minutes of really trying to focus. And this is a 75-minute lecture with a far more intense flow of information than would have been used in the studies that established the normal attention span. So you can manage that by using your resources. Check the video recording or the posted slides for anything you missed. But I am not an entertainer. I'm not a motivational speaker. I'm not a comedian. I'm not an improv artist. I'm not even trained as a speaker. What I will strive to be is competent, caring, and ethical. I'll not bullshit you. I will correct myself if I see I'm wrong. I'll make reasonable adjustments to reasonable feedback. And I will provide you with all the resources that I can. So you know that overall, 45% of incoming SMU students do not graduate by year 6. Is that because they flunked out or dropped out? Were they DFW students? Is it because there were A students who transferred to another institution? Is it because they got good jobs without needing to get a degree? Is it because they had a baby and decided to be a stay-at-home parent? I don't know. What I can tell you is what the DFW rates are for my courses, which I hear are typical. The DFW rate refers to the percentage of students who earn a final grade of D, F, or W. It's calculated out of those who remain enrolled in the course after the last day to drop it with no penalty of any kind. Previous DFW rates for my courses have ranged from 12 to 20% under different circumstances, so let's just average those and say a reasonable expectation for the DFW rate in this class is 17%, and that would work out to 2 students. The DFW rates for the quizzes so far were 2 students on quiz 1 and 3 students on quiz 2. I would say that those outcomes are statistically expected. I have noticed 3 patterns in my own DFW students, and some students show all 3 patterns at once. Some students will panic and drop the course with a W because of anxiety. They don't think that they can cope. My management strategy for that is to use frequent low-stakes grading with a lot of feedback, open book testing, rubrics, getting one's accommodation in place, connecting people to resources, allowing resubmissions, and generally communicating that I'm your ally and not out to get you. I don't have much of a management strategy for students who don't submit work. I'll reach out, ask them what's going on, maybe refer them to the dean's office. I don't know what's going on then. I don't know if they just don't care. And one prof has speculated that some students may just need, for some paperwork reasons, maybe because they're applying for something else, like an internship, to be a full-time student and have full-time status. So maybe they just sign up for something and don't complete it. Or maybe they're people who self-undermine out of fear of failure. Maybe they think, if I don't hand it in, I got a 0 because I didn't hand it in. not because I have low academic ability. And perhaps those students are confusing grades with self-worth. I also noticed some narcissistic patterns. I noticed those when I was reading reviews. One of them is a sense of entitlement, expecting an A without demonstrating substantive effort or competence. Another one is intolerance of boredom, expecting me to be an entertainer. I never signed up for that. The pressure to make science exciting and hook people in with stories is one that I actively resist. It pushes me in the direction of distorting information in order to tell some grand narrative that emotionally captures you. I think that can be very misleading. It's the way that myths have entered psychology, and frankly, I don't want to be teaching fiction. Sometimes those students will be actively disengage and cheat, and then lie about cheating. It's very tedious. I'll spread disinformation about my classes, I assume, to perhaps make themselves feel better, perhaps because they are associating a grade with self-worth. I don't have a management strategy for those students at this time, and there's nothing about the way that I am compensated or promoted that has to do with my DFW rates. I manage that because I care. So let's say that you don't want a satisfactory grade. You want a D, F, or a W. What do you need to do? Do not read or refer to the syllabus. Don't do the readings. Just try to guess and Google things on the quiz. Don't read my class emails. Don't listen to or engage in lecture. Don't take notes. Miss the deadlines. Don't use your resources. And find ways to undermine yourself. Procrastination is a really good one. Don't talk to me about your fears or concerns, assume the worst and drop the class in panic, and put up with things that you resent. Things that I could, if only I knew, probably do something to fix. Find a way to cheat and assume I won't notice or follow up. Feel entitled to a good or excellent grade in a context of low standards that is constantly fun. Now that you're in your teams, please be kind to your teammates by putting in a satisfactory effort. Here's some information that I hope is helpful on team dynamics. According to Tuckman's model of team development, there are 5 stages of team development. They are forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. Your first job for the forming stage is to get to know each other authentically. So what skills do you bring to your group? What are your weaknesses? Are there some boundaries that you need to be clear about? Say, what if you work 9 to 5 and need to distribute the work in small periods on the evenings and the weekends? Or what if you can't work on the weekends because of family obligations? Who will do what? By when? What if they don't? A good strategy is to work back from a deadline, which you usually know. So if your paper is due November 12th, then maybe you want your first draft in, say, 3 days before that. Whatever works for you and your team. This will help you realize when you need to get big deliverables started, and it helps people understand that leaving everything to the last minute is not a good plan. Something else to think about is, how will you communicate? The university provides you with a suite of tools that includes Microsoft Teams. If someone in your group doesn't want to use Facebook or Google for whatever reason, then you can't make them. The next expected stage is conflict. Conflict is normal in teams. There will be miscommunications, misunderstandings, accidents. And it's okay to not like each other. So it's not about avoiding conflict, it's about managing it well. Managing it adaptively so that you can achieve your group goal. When you run into trouble, it can be helpful to use I statements, saying, when you do X, I feel Y. Those tend to work better than accusations like, you always, or you never. Sometimes it's best to let someone save face if that leads to the behavior change you need to see. Communication clear and open and kind, and look for win-win solutions. But at the end of the day, you need to prioritize group goals. Sometimes teammates don't deliver. I'm sure you've had this happen to you before. You can prevent this by setting expectations and doing some coaching if need be. In this class, for the team assignment, I'll give you a peer evaluation form. There are times when you need to escalate an issue with the team to the instructor, And there are times when you need to escalate a concern with the instructor to the department chair, like when you're thrown into a dysfunctional team without any kind of support for managing team dynamics. After storming comes norming. That's the point when you've established group norms and people settle into their roles to achieve the group's objectives. In the performing stage, you're working together to get the job done. You're playing to each other's strengths, covering for each other's weaknesses, which of course you've talked about, and respecting each other's reasonable expectations and boundaries. If you don't do the groundwork, you may never get to this stage. It's natural for groups to break up once their shared task is complete. Sometimes it's nice to debrief, to consider what worked and what didn't. If you enjoyed working with someone, maybe you should make a point of keeping that connection. There's something to be said for keeping records, for having agendas and minutes. I don't know if you'll go to that level of formality, but it is good to have records, at least of agreements, because humans forget things. Make sure that everyone's clear on what the plan is, even if that's just through an email summarizing what happened. If you or someone else ends up raising some kind of complaint, as sometimes happens, it is to your advantage to have the record. Listening is a skill. It's good to acknowledge people's contributions, make eye contact, and engage in what they say. And folks who speak English as a second language, as an additional language. Often they speak many languages, and English isn't the second, it might be the fifth. So folks who speak English as an additional language need a little extra time to comprehend, to think about what they're going to say, to translate it out of their first language. So please be aware of rushing ahead without them. Keep in mind that people, especially agreeable people, may speak in indirect, symbolic ways because they're trying to be pleasing and polite. They may ask for things in a way that's so indirect that you have to read through their lines. Disagreeable people and dominant people will flatly state what they want, and that's not everyone. There is an assumption that all students are the traditional students, where that means an unmarried, middle or upper middle class, able-bodied, mentally well-adjusted white domestic student aged about 22 and attending school full-time. That is a myth. There are more students who do not fall into that category. There are students who work full-time, students with disabilities, students who speak international students, students who speak English as an additional language, students from working class backgrounds, students who have full-time jobs or kids at home. How's your group going to accommodate the diverse needs that come from those different identities? Don't assume that the students in front of you are the prototype mythical student, because they're probably not. With that, let's cover Chapter 5, your reading for today. We are now at Stage 3 in the OD practitioner's lifestyle and organization. Stage 3 refers to the process of diagnosing an organizational problem. So one of your big problems as an OD practitioner is, who is the client? The next one is, what's the problem? Problem diagnosis is a systemic approach that allows you to understand the present state of the organization. That's easier said than done. You need to understand what the problem is, and we're assuming there's one problem. Maybe there are even multiple problems. You need to understand what's causing the problem or problems so that you can recommend a solution. That process will involve collecting data from primary sources like interviews and questionnaires that you conduct and deliver yourself, or from secondary sources like data the organization has already collected for some other purpose, or reports they've already published. The client will offer you a diagnosis of the problem, even very confidently. Absolutely listen to the client, but question their diagnosis as a rule, diplomatically, of course. They are part of the system that's dysfunctional, part of the culture, and probably part of the problem. You're going to need to do some fact-checking, and you'll need to consider the issue from different perspectives. According to your textbook, the data and its presentation should be simple. I do not agree. You may not be dealing with a simple problem. A complex problem may need to be understood and communicated in complex ways. But what you should try to do is make your analysis and recommendations easy for the client to understand. Avoid fancy technical terms and jargon. Make it lay accessible. If you collect or analyze data that's complex, say qualitative responses to open-ended questions, then you need a plan for how you're going to analyze that, which is within your capacity and your resources. They say that visibility is another issue in diagnosis. What does that mean? The text says, use visible measures of what is happening. What does that mean? I assume it means use reasonably objective measures. Or maybe it means that clients like pretty pie charts. Involvement means, I quote, emphasize the participation and involvement of organization members in the diagnosis. In practice, you're not going to be able to collect all the data you'd like from everyone. In any organization of any significant size, that would be impossibly time-consuming and possibly risky. People might wonder what you're up to and what you're doing with the data, and you'll just end up with way more than you can use. But suffice to say, you will need to identify and involve at least the key stakeholders. With regard to primary factors, the textbook says, use an undistorted collection of primary operating variables in the diagnosis. What does that mean? If you figure it out, let me know. It might mean that you have to find out what variables are important to the success of the change program. Those variables would be the causes of the problem, which you have to figure out. Those causes, those factors, then need to be operationalized as variables and defined and measured in a valid way that minimizes bias. Another opportunity you have in the diagnosis process is to figure out how urgently the change is needed, because your client may or may not be aware of that. The diagnostic process involves identifying the problem areas. It's something you need to do with the client. You might brainstorm the problem, what might be causing it. You might look at some available data, but then you need to check back with the client, as that may have you going back to the drawing board. For the purpose of your assignment, act like I'm the client. Once you competently collect the data, you need to be able to competently analyze it and communicate the key messages or recommendations for next steps back to the client. The client may or may not be interested or motivated to hear the results or do anything about it. The client might just want a performative consultation to check a box and say that they had a consultation before they go and do whatever they wanted to do in the first place. As I've mentioned before, this book, which I'd rate it 3 out of 5 stars, has a consistency problem. Sometimes information is presented that's inconsistent with the other things you've learned. In their figure showing the diagnostic process on page 119, they say that after you diagnose the causes of the problem with an authentically motivated client, you get a change program with successful results. That jumps from stage 3 to stage 5 of their favorite figure on their 5-stage model of the OD process. It's okay to be confused when the book is actually confusing. A good place to start a diagnosis is in identifying the gap between what the organization should be doing and what it's actually doing. That's the performance gap. Do keep in mind, though, that clients can have unreasonable ideals and expectations for performance. Now, the book said that you should use visible measures of what is happening. What's with this cone-shaped diagram? It looks very geometrical and very mathematical. It has ticks and arrows. Management textbooks are prone to presenting this kind of figure because they look so scientific. I think it just makes things more complicated. All it means is that people in the organization have an idea of what their desired performance is, and that may be reasonable or unreasonable, but there will be a gap, some difference between what they want to be achieving and what they're actually achieving. That's why they hired you. At SMU, most of the revenue comes from undergraduate student enrollment, and enrollment does not meet operations. Revenue does not cover the operating budget. You can't play that game for long. After this problem was identified in late spring of this year, as you must have noticed, the university hiked tuition by 3% for domestic and 8% for international students. They projected higher enrollment for the fall, but unfortunately, enrollment is down. That's a problem with predicting the future. Sometimes the future just doesn't obey your prediction. A gap analysis looks at the organization's strengths. What do we do well? How can we leverage that? What are our weaknesses? And can anything be done? I'll leave that for you to discuss in your teams. This is one way you can prompt thinking about areas for change. Your textbook gets an F on statistics. Data refers to things known or assumed as facts that make the basis of reasoning or calculation. All data has form and structure. The number 2 has form and structure. It looks like a 2. It refers to 2 of something. That sounds like structure. But how is that important? It's important if you have not 1 but 2 problems. There's a difference between statistics and data. Data is summarized and analyzed into statistics. All data is information. It just might not be useful or meaningful information. We want to get to information that's contextualized, organized, and meaningful. Also, you cannot be a statistic. You could be represented by a datum that is part of the calculation of a statistic. The text is also in error when it talks about the benefits of systemic data collection. Okay, collecting data haphazardly probably isn't a good plan, but the word random doesn't mean haphazard. It means that every item in a set is equally likely to be selected. So selecting a student at random from the class means that every student in the class is equally likely to be selected, not just the A students or the D students or the students sitting in the front row. But systematically collected data isn't necessarily unbiased data. I could systematically collect the data from the students in the front row. And then that's their results, their experiences, their traits might not generalize to the rest of the class. If I assume that they are like everyone else or that everyone else is like them, I could be wrong. So you can collect data in a systematic way that is also biased. It's just systematically biased. Anyway, none of this is actually about the process of data collection. Start the data collection process by defining the objective of the change program. In the case of the OD intervention you'll be studying for your team assignment, management's objective is to increase retention. That's actually not the original objective of the program itself. The nice career development people wanted to make students less stressed and more hopeful about the future because they care. The original objective was student well-being. Managers saw the possibility of that increasing retention. They drew that link. The counselors who designed the program actually didn't have retention as the first thing on their mind. But then counselors are managed. They work for the organization. So you see, who is the client is a complex problem. What are your central variables? What do you think the factors are that are driving the problem? And how do you measure the problem? If the problem is retention, how do you measure that? Are you going to wait 6 years to see who graduates, or are there some good short-term measures? If it's something about well-being, how do you measure that? If the intervention proposes to increase adaptability or employability, how do you measure that? Once you know what the key variables are, and that might involve some brainstorming, going back and forth with the client, how are you going to gather the data? One way to gather information is to look for secondary data. SMU is a public body and you'll find information in financial reports. You can also look up collective agreements for unionized employees. You can collect your own data from surveys. This assumes you know enough to write or find a good survey question because it's maddening for people to get a dumb question that they have to give an answer to on a 5-point scale and they can't answer not applicable or it depends. So what they do, they circle 3? And then what does that 3 mean when you crunch the numbers and produce a mean of 3.75? Open-ended qualitative questions give you richer data, but it's hard to analyze. So maybe you start with qualitative data from interviews and focus groups, and then move to surveys when you know what you're doing. Here's an example of an organizational culture survey. There are 30 things that this organization acknowledges that it shouldn't be doing. And by the way, this is from an organization with a clan culture. I could not imagine employees in a bureaucracy ever getting something like this in their email. You can also see that they think that being bureaucratic is a bad thing because it's on their list. So the employee is supposed to pick the 5 things that people in the organization should stop doing or de-emphasize, like playing favorites, lying, and being abusive. Which 5 do you pick? And what if you needed something else that isn't there? I'm assuming they got these 30 things from focus groups where people talk about what they hate about their jobs, and now they want to see which 5 are the 5 worst things that everyone in the organization hates the most. By the way, the organization that used this survey is ranked as one of the most ethical companies in the world. You don't lie about lying. That's an indication of honesty and humility and leadership. Again, when they ask people what they need to see from their leaders, they get 2 choices from 13 directions that I can only assume were directions that leaders are actually willing to go in. All this is to say there's been some groundwork before they went and created the quantitative measure. And that groundwork is probably qualitative research. The organization will have a structure with some degree of hierarchy that tells you what the official reporting relationships are, but human relationships are more complicated than that. Some people like each other, some people don't, and people will work together across official lines. I belong to at least a few academic cliques, and those that I belong to that are within the organization span staff, full-time faculty, part-time faculty, and administrators who all share similar values. The cliques also span organizations because people take jobs in other organizations and keep on working together. I share and receive information with them that they or I wouldn't otherwise know, and that's how information gets shared around and decisions get made unofficially and informally. An organization with a lot of cliques may lack coherent structure or a general sense of unity. That can be a sign of a weak culture and poor coordination. In order to find out about the psychosocial substructure of the organization, you can survey people with questions like, who do you like to work with and who don't you like to work with? Obviously, very sensitive social matters that people might not be comfortable talking about directly, or even answering a survey about. But that information can be mapped out in a sociogram, which tells you who's popular and who's not. It also tells you where the cliques are. Workplaces can be like junior high school all over again. Another thing you can do is simply observe. Look for inconsistency between the organization's articulated values and what you see practiced through their artifacts. Consider the way I observed where the reserved parking spaces were and who they were reserved for. We saw that they were de facto reserved for administrators who, with the exception of the president, labeled themselves as faculty. The reserved space that was the furthest away from the door was the space reserved for all people with disabilities. Normally, you try to keep the accessible parking closest to the door. That's kind of the point. So ostensibly, the university's brand is community and accessibility, but isn't what I was reading from the artifacts of parking. In fact, I was seeing the opposite. Interviews are one of the most widely used data collection methods in OD. You can get a lot of information out of interviews, but it's also hard to process, hard to analyze the data. To do it systematically, you need to ask everyone the same questions and qualitatively analyze the transcripts of their answers. It's a lot of work, and then you lose the freedom, the potential of the freewheeling, unstructured interview. So more often than not, you're analyzing the data with your gut feelings, which reflect your own personal insights and biases. You will never have a perfect data collection plan. Once you have a reasonable one that's within your capacities and that taps the key stakeholders in a way that's not monumentally biased, you'll need to implement it. The amount of time that data collection will take is probably more than you expected. It's best to do a small pilot first before you do a large data collection. So, in a pilot, you'll use the planned instruments and methods with a small group of people, get their feedback so you can make corrections and debug your surveys before you go and launch a large-scale data collection process. Piloting is a nautical term. A pilot is an experienced and knowledgeable sailor who can maneuver through dangerous waters in his pilot ship, and therefore figure out and lead a safe path that the captain of the big clumsy cargo ship can follow to come safely into port. This helps avoid costly accidents. The method you use to analyze the data depends on the type of data. Obviously, quantitative data is analyzed with quantitative methods and qualitative data is analyzed with qualitative methods. Is the type of analysis decided prior to the data collection? Not always. Sometimes you get some data and figure out what to do with it later. That's what you have to do with secondary data. The data itself can throw surprises your way, and you'll have to figure out how to handle them. That statement is overly simplistic. I think they're trying to encourage you to work out a plan before you start doing things. Before you go collect data, you should think about whether and how you can analyze it. Don't go doing lots of interviews if you have little capacity for qualitative analysis. The data you collect will likely be far from perfect, but validity still matters. You should actually be measuring what you think you're measuring. There were questions on the employee engagement survey that recently went out at SMU from one of the IO labs here to all employees that I wanted to answer not applicable, or I don't know to, or what do you mean, or depends on the context, but all I was allowed to do was pick an answer from 1 to 5. So I'd pick 3. I wrote to the vice president who was chalked into this survey to explain that the average result, and to explain that the results, which will come back in numbers like 3.5, don't necessarily mean what you think they mean from what you thought they should have been thinking. You should have done a pilot first, collected feedback, and then made revisions before sending out a survey to all the employees. My impression of the university after receiving that survey was not one that made me feel that things were being competently managed. The strategies that you use to collect and analyze data need to be feasible, meaning that you have the time and the money to implement them. They need to be appropriate to the organizational culture. You can't hold a town hall or a focus group and invite personal contributions from people in an organization with a toxic culture where they can't speak freely because they might get hurt by somebody who's listening. You'd use anonymous surveys for that, maybe private one-on-one meetings, and people will trust a survey or an interviewer far more if they're from an external agency, especially a reputable one, rather than an internal practitioner. Remember, internal practitioners are subject to internal politics. Also be aware that collecting data is an intervention. When you go asking questions, you give people ideas, you send a message, maybe that something's wrong, maybe that management cares or is trying to do something about it. Or people might cynically see it as more performative gestures. Although your book emphasizes the importance of validity in data collection, they do recommend some tools that are in fact not valid scientific instruments. There is no valid way to infer organizational climate or motivation for achievement, power, or affiliation from someone's answer to a question like, what do you see in that ink blot? That picture from the thematic apperception test makes me think of COVID, and I think that ink blot looks like a cat. Does that tell you anything about my achievement, power, affiliation, motivation, or the climate of this class? If it did, you'd probably be seeing the connections post hoc based on information you already know. You'd be rationalizing the connection. The validity of a tool like this is found in its ability to predict future behavior, and there's no evidence to support the validity of these instruments. You'd want to read organizational climate or culture from the actual artifacts of the organization, and what somebody says about an ink blot is a very questionable organizational artifact. It might be related to anything else. It could be something personal, like whether or not they have a cat. I'm going to point to another inconsistency in the text. In the last chapter, you learned that employees who relate to the OD practitioner in the apathetic, cynical style, who won't care and share with the practitioner, are toxic employees who fail to accept personal responsibility for their own behavior. Ew. That is how a castigating parent talks to an unruly child. That's an unhealthy parent-child dynamic, not a healthy adult-adult dynamic. And employees are adults and professionals. This is a paragraph from a student success resource that SMU was delivering to undergraduates to support student success and retention. The book is called Power Learning and Your Life: Essentials of Student Success. It's written by academics to support undergraduate student success. It was a chapter on making good decisions. It teaches that real adults take personal responsibility. I assign that reading to my introduction to psychology students, and I invite you to pause the recording to read that paragraph slowly. Does that sound right to you? After I raised a complaint about it, the textbook publisher issued an apology to the university and pulled the paragraph out. It was removed from all the print books and all the e-books of this text in North America. But taking out one paragraph doesn't address the whole academic culture behind the book. This attitude pops up in a lot of different ways in different places in their advice on how to live your life and be successful. The material on team dynamics that I presented earlier in this lecture came from this book, and I may refer to it again for the information that it contains that is genuinely useful. And I might put that into a lecture, but there are reasons why I will never directly assign material from this text to students again. So, what's this chapter saying about the cynical, apathetic employee? Once an appropriate technique has been selected, the actual data collection program must be accomplished. This includes the operational aspects of designing, printing, distributing, and collecting the data collection instrument. Outside data collection agents are more effective than internal personnel. The use of outside data collection agents is recommended because it apparently makes respondents feel more secure and trusting that candid answers will not be used against them. What does that tell you about trust in leadership? What does that tell you about psychological safety? Here's another one. The use of the questionnaire method depends upon the depth of information desired and the purpose of the information. In some organizations, survey follows survey, but without any effective change. This often leads to apathy and indifference in answering any subsequent surveys. Apathy. So what does that tell you about the systemic reasons that employees may be apathetic or cynical? What does that tell you about articulated versus practiced values of an organization? There are several diagnostic models that you can use to approach a diagnosis. They are the Differentiation-Integration Model, the Sociotechnical Systems Model, and force field analysis. The Differentiation-Integration Model looks at organizational siloing. An organization has different units that can develop different goals and cultures, and they can start working against each other. That kind of friction, that kind of dysfunction undermines organizational functioning and the ability of the organization as a whole to meet its goals. The differentiation-integration approach collects data on how departments or units interact with each other and on how their cultures differ so that you can help them work together. An international student from the Caribbean who was perhaps regretful of her enrollment complained to me of feeling exploited for cash rather than cared about in a personal way. International students pay 2 or 3 times as much as domestic students for the same services. She said that this issue was freely discussed by Caribbean students themselves, but they felt unable to challenge the situation as guests in the country. The notion of community is used to market the university because it's small. So, according to her story, and this is an interview, it could be biased, it's one person, but according to her account, recruiters visiting the islands had actively marketed the university to students as a place that they'd be cared about in a really personal way. And this created expectations on the part of the students. I asked her how long it took her to figure out that that was marketing. She answered that it took about 3 months. Though recruiters are responsible for obtaining enrollments, faculty are not responsible for implementing romantic recruitment narratives. Faculty are free to act in ways that don't demonstrate caring. They may show disinterest, impatience, distance. They can even be callous. Caring is emotional labor of a personal nature that's not included in a faculty member's job description or collective agreement or contract, and put into practice, caring may or may not be adaptive. It may or may not achieve desirable outcomes for the student or the organization. So it could present risks. Say, what if a faculty member acted outside of their scope of competence or qualification, say by providing support or counseling when that's not what they're trained to do? Or what if there was an issue in how they handled student personal information? What if they gossip about a student and violate privacy because they're trying to handle a situation by talking about it with their colleagues? I know that these are too low resolution for you to see, but these are old org charts from the Associate Vice President Academic Enrollment Management and Student Services. These are different arms of the organization. They show that the 6 international recruiters reported to the Director of Recruitment and Marketing under the AVP Academic and Enrollment Management. Student Culture and Experience falls under a different portfolio, falls under Student Services, with the Assistant Director of that portfolio managing the 3 employees of the International Student Center. None of those positions have any communication or synchronization with, let alone power over, faculty. Faculty would report to a department chair or program coordinator within their department, and those people would report to the deans of the relevant faculties. Undergrad instructors report to the chair of the department, who reports to the dean of the faculty, like Faculty of Art or Faculty of Science, and graduate program coordinators report to the dean of the Faculty of Graduate Studies. The interests of faculty are represented by the 2 faculty unions, which spar with the administration over what faculty have to do, which is all itemized in collective agreements that you can find online. If you look at those documents, I don't think you'll find anything at all that speaks to how international students will receive a personal touch from faculty. That's a story that sells seats in a program, but there's no accountability for that narrative built into the system. In fact, I don't know which students are international students, and until that student talked to me, I had no idea that I was supposed to treat them differently or treat any student in any particular way at all. And you've seen my contract. This all came as a surprise to me. Now, none of that information is on the test. I'm telling you this to make a point about siloing. Recruitment and marketing, the actual student experience, and how faculty behave all fall under different silos that don't talk to each other. And there, in the middle of all of it, is a confused and resentful student who didn't get what they were expecting. In Chapter 2, you learned about the sociotechnical systems model. You learned that there were 5 subsystems in an organization, and that the managerial subsystem had the role of coordinating all the other subsystems towards achieving organizational goals. Now, in Chapter 5, they're saying that there's only 2 subsystems. What just happened? Well, they've taken 4 subsystems, the managerial subsystem, the psychosocial subsystem, and the structural subsystem, and said, that's all social stuff. It's about hierarchy and cliques and written and unwritten behavior codes. So they're lumping those together into the social subsystem. This framework asks, how are these 2 subsystems, social, and the one that's left over, technical, how are they working together in regard to what is required by the environmental supersystem? And that just means all the other systems that are outside the organization. I will note that the text is using the words system and subsystem in a way that is inconsistent. So these were once called subsystems, now they're being called systems. This is a useful framework, if only because it emphasizes the technical subsystem, and OD practitioners often disregard it. Yet, it's essential for getting anything done. Thinking about the technical subsystem gets us out of our heads and into the practical exigencies of the real world. Force field analysis does not refer to the measurement of the energy output of the employee midi-chlorians. It is the idea that when you want to change something in a certain direction, there are forces in the organization which resist that change and forces that would drive that change forward. When those forces are balanced in strength, the organization is in a state called quasi-stationary equilibrium. Things are going to stay the same according to whatever the measure is, rather than to improve or get worse. So when all the resisting forces and all the driving forces are balanced and are offsetting each other, then there is no change. And for at least that measure, things will stay the same. I want to draw your attention to a sentence I believe is in error. On page 129, the book states that force field analysis assumes that at any given moment, an organization is in a state of equilibrium. I don't think that's right. In the particular moment that the driving forces overwhelm the restraining forces, it's not in equilibrium. It's changing in the direction of the change you want. If the restraining forces overwhelm the driving forces, then you're going backwards. I suspect that the word any was used in error. So, if you want something to change, what can you do to promote that? Well, you'd want to boost the driving forces for change and weaken or buffer against the effects of the restraining forces. You would be ill-advised to undermine the driving forces and promote the restraining forces. For your assignment, you might want to think about what the driving forces for student success are and what the restraining forces are. There are some things to watch out for or be aware of in the diagnosis process. First of all, be aware that you're handling what is sensitive material. It's information that can be exposing and embarrassing for management. It could be used against them. They're the ones who communicate about any organizational change processes and the results, especially in a public way, not you. Be aware of going behind management's back or over their heads, even when you're communicating within the organization. You might be the one drafting the email that they approve and send. Here are some other common tripping points in the diagnosis process. One of them is the analysis paralysis. At some point, continued problem analysis causes more harm than good because there are decreasing marginal returns to doing more analysis. At some point, and there will never be a perfect point where you know everything, you need to move forward with some imperfect action that you hope will change things in the right direction. Now, the client has contacted you because there's a crisis on their hands. 45% of students are dropping out. Oh no, there's a big money problem. Oh no, staff are quitting because we can't pay them enough. Oh no, a student went to the media. Oh shit. These immediate crises are symptoms of some bigger problem or problems that needs a wider perspective and more long-term strategy to solve. These crises create a strong sense of urgency that invite you to over-focus on symptoms and miss the big picture. Something I've really noticed at SMU is that when people on the inside speculate on the retention problem, they refer to their own area of expertise or experience. If you only have a hammer, everything's a nail. I think that an elitist culture is a major problem, and I see that everywhere, easily. Is that because that's an objective view of the problem, or is that because of something about me or my experience? Similarly, faculty often think it's about academic skills and preparedness. Counselors think it's about student mental health. Career development professionals think it's about career development. That's why it's important to do research, to do interviews, to get different perspectives. You need to be cautious when you communicate back to the client. If you notice that the place is falling apart and on fire and the leaders are dysfunctional, arrogant fools, you can't tell them that even if it's true. Research on the hexaco model of personality suggests that managers run more narcissistic. That alone will create problems, and it also means that they are thin-skinned and hypersensitive to embarrassment and criticism and desirous of saving face. Political acumen has its place. Lead in the direction they need to go, let them feel like there's an actionable next step they can take to a better place. Last, I'd like to draw your attention to the case analysis tool in the textbook. The case analysis method is described on page 27 of your book, and there's a copy of the analysis form on page 29. It also recurs throughout your book. The case analysis for Chapter 5 is called the Old Family Bank. There's been one every chapter. You'll find the solution for that case posted on Brightspace. The case analysis tool prompts you to think about the issue at the immediate local level as a micro problem, and it prompts you to think about system-level macro problems. It also guides you to brainstorm causes for the problem and to think about how the various organizational subsystems are affected. It prompts you to propose some alternatives and then summarize your recommendation. Have a look at that. Thank you for your attention, and please feel welcome to reach out with questions or comments. Please read Chapter 6 on resistance to change for Thursday, and I look forward to seeing you then. Bye for now.